Hi, I apologise for the fact that this is a video rather than an audio. It's because my audio file thing won't work. That might be partly because I dropped the flash drive into my coffee. It's also been a problem this week that I've had a cold. You can probably hear that I've still got a bit of it, so I'm a bit disorganised. So it's a closing video instead of a closing audio. That's quite appropriate in a sort of way, isn't it? Two things I wanted to talk about. The first, I wanted to say how much I have enjoyed being involved with you guys over this quarter, and to say how good you've been at being involved with the material. The way in which you've been involved with the Old Testament through the quarter has far exceeded anything I could have dreamt of. I confess that maybe like loads of people, I thought that online courses were really a soft option compared with classroom courses, whereas in terms of work on your part and on my part, well, certainly on my part, it's more effort, more time involved than in a classroom course. And in the nature of your involvement with the material, I think that's true too. I've had brought home to me the fact that when you are in the classroom, I've got no idea what you're doing sitting there at a desk. You could be just daydreaming, whereas the way an online course works, you can't be daydreaming in the same sort of way. And the quality of the interaction that's gone on has often been really great, so that's excited me. The particular thing I was going to talk about briefly was Daniel, just to restate again the way I understand the process whereby the book of Daniel came into existence, which is a kind of extreme version of what's true about some other parts of the Old Testament and the New Testament. I'm not, I think, saying anything different from what I've said in the material or from what Coogan says. But it might help if I kind of restate it. My understanding of the process is something like this. There were people like Daniel and his friends who went through the kind of tough experiences in the context of the exile, which became the dispersion in Babylon and Persia, in the context of those two empires, and in the context of being under Greek control too, in the period after the Persian Empire. And the kind of things that happened to Daniel and his friends is the kind of thing that happened in that context. And I imagine that these stories about how God amazingly delivered people from the pressures and enabled them to survive and often to triumph reflect experiences that people really had. The stories are portrayed in larger-than-life terms, and I don't know precisely where's the nature of the difference between things that actually happened and things as the stories portray them. But I assume that these stories are based on experiences that people had and ways in which God actually delivered them. One other thing about the stories then is that they emphasize things about God. As I pointed out once or twice in responses to the postings, often it's easy for us to focus on how terrific these guys were in their faithfulness to God. It's important to see that in the stories it's at least as significant that God is faithful to them. I assume that the vision that is related in Daniel 2 is something that goes back to those guys and to somebody like Daniel. But that then what happened over a period of centuries is not only that the stories came to be significant for people living in a very different kind of context, namely the context of persecution in Jerusalem itself in the 2nd century, in that time of domination by the Seleucids, and particularly the oppression of Antiochus Epiphanes. Not only did the stories become significant, but the vision came to be significant, and the fact that God was in control of the story of the empires came to be really important for them. And that led people whose names we don't know to meditate on those visions and let God to reveal in more detail what he'd been doing in that period between Daniel's day and the 2nd century, and to talk about the way in which he'd been in control of those events, but for God to lead them to express that in terms of the kind of vision that Daniel might have had. because that was a familiar way of expressing the conviction that God was in control, a familiar way that they would know about. And that then led into promises of the way in which God would deliver them from that persecution. So the visions aren't simply about the future, neither are they simply about the past. They are standing at a point when people have gone through the kind of experience that the earlier part of the visions portrays, and are offered the promise that God will deliver them. And God did deliver them in a marvellous and extraordinary and amazing way, in rescuing them from the persecution of Antiochus. And that led the people in Jerusalem, this is my hypothesis, to say, wow, those visions obviously were true, weren't they? Because we did get delivered. And that's what led the community to hold on to them, led to their being regarded as scripture, as visions that really came from God. They weren't visions that were looking forward to an end that was going to come in Jesus' day, or an end that still lies ahead of us. But there were visions that found a partial fulfillment in Daniel's day, in the 2nd century, in Antiochus' day, but still are talking about an event that lay ahead of the 2nd century and lay ahead of the New Testament and lies ahead to us. And so they promise both God's immediate involvement in people's lives, which happened in that 2nd century context and which happened again in Jesus' day, but they also promise an ultimate fulfillment of God's purpose. And as at this moment we still are working our way through Advent, aware of what God did in Jesus, but also aware of how the first Advent needs to be completed by the second Advent. They are visions that continue to offer us God's promise. It's been great to work with you during this time.